Good evening and a warm welcome to all of you to this special event tonight. Goddam Dangerous, a stage reading of historical documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis. My name is Andreas Etges. Together with my dear colleague Alexandra Schenke, I was in charge of the exhibition and theater project. It started with the idea to curate a special exhibit on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis together with a group of students. And when I was reading a book that had a special focus on the correspondence between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, and that also included a few scenes on stage, however fictionalized one. I didn't like those scenes, but that triggered an idea. There is also in Germany a tradition of stage reading of historical documents. And I felt the letters the main protagonists wrote, the speeches they gave, the meetings they held, that could and should be brought onto a stage. I immediately called Alexandra, who not only shares my deep interest in Cold War history, but having earned degrees in acting and film at a New York conservatory, would bring a lot of experience to bringing things on stage. She loved the idea right away, and it cost her. She spent endless hours editing the first and way too long script I wrote and bringing it closer and closer to the staged version that you will see today. And she also spent many, many hours managing and directing this production, rehearsing with our wonderful group of students and those who created the accompanying multimedia presentation and who, together with Jana Schweers of Amerikahaus, are in charge of light, sound, and the PowerPoint presentation today. Like the exhibit, the stage reading turned out to grow bigger and better, meaning everyone spent way more time on this than they had expected. But I think in the team we all agree it was worth it. After the stage reading, 3 of the students, as well as Alexandra and I, will be happy to answer questions both on what you saw today, how we performed, how we did this, and on the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. And you can stay a little longer at Amerikahaus today anyway to see the exhibit after the stage reading and also to get a drink and chat with us or with each other. Our exhibition and theater project would not have been possible without our host, the Amerikahaus Munich, and a special thank you to Dominik Rabe, as well as funding from the US Embassy Berlin, the US Consulate General Munich, the Alumni Association of the Amerika-Institut, the Lasky Center for Transatlantic Studies. And in late July, we spent 3 wonderful days at the Akademie für politische Bildung Tutzing, which enabled us to make major progress on the exhibit and the stage reading and to jump into Starnberger See. A big thank you from all of us for this support. And now it is time, first, to turn off your cell phones if you haven't done that. And second, for me to literally play a different role and also in a sense wear a different hat and hand over to my colleague Alexandra Schenke for Goddam Dangerous, a stage reading of historical documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Enjoy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our simulation of the 13 days that have gone down in history as a time when the world hovered on the brink of nuclear war. Everything you will hear and see on the stage tonight is based on excerpts from primary documents, such as letters, speeches, and records of top-secret crisis meetings. With some exceptions, these primary sources will be presented to you without alteration, allowing you to draw back the curtain and take a look behind the scenes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We invite you to follow the leaders of the United States, Cuba, and the Soviet Union, as well as their advisors, as they navigate this immensely tense time in world history. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our players. On the US-American side of the stage, we have young President John F. Kennedy, in office for less than 2 years when faced with this crisis. Among his advisors in these trying times are his brother, US Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and National Security Advisor Mac George Bundy. They are followed here by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Finally, we have General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff and our representative of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as Adlai Stevenson, US Ambassador to the United Nations. On the Soviet side of our stage, we have first Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Chairman of the Council of Ministers, Nikita Khrushchev. Among his advisors are his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, Ambassador to the UN, Valerian Zorin, and Anatoly Dobrinin, Soviet Ambassador to the United States. And finally, taking center stage tonight, we have first Secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba and Prime Minister Fidel Castro. Our story, however, does not begin with the discovery of Soviet missiles on Cuba in the fall of 1962. Instead, let us take you back to October 6, 1960, when a charismatic senator named John F. Kennedy addressed fellow Democrats in Cincinnati, Ohio, during his campaign for President of the United States.
I want to talk with you tonight about the most glaring failure of American foreign policy today, about a disaster that threatens the security of the whole Western Hemisphere, about a communist menace that has been permitted to arise under our very noses, only 90 miles from our shores. All of Cuba is in the iron grip of a communist-oriented police state. Castro and his gang have betrayed the ideals of the Cuban Revolution and the hopes of the Cuban people. He has transformed the island of Cuba into a hostile and militant communist satellite, a base from which to carry communist infiltration and subversion throughout the Americas. We not only ignored poverty and distress in Cuba, we have failed in the past 8 years to relieve poverty and distress throughout the hemisphere. If we continue to devote greater effort to the support of dictators than to the fight against poverty and hunger, then rising discontent will provide fertile ground for Castro and his communist friends.
A historic election makes John F. Kennedy the 35th President of the United States. And soon after taking office, many months before he would convene his advisors to weather the Cuban Missile Crisis, the young president commences a steady correspondence with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, a correspondence which initially brims with cautious optimism.
Esteemed Mr. Kennedy, allow me to congratulate you on the occasion of your election to the high post of the President of the United States. I think you will agree that the eyes of many people are fixed on the United States and the Soviet Union because the destinies of world peace depend largely on the state of Soviet-American relations. We are ready to develop the most friendly relations between the Soviet and the American peoples, between the governments of the USSR and the United States.
Esteemed Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that you're conscious, as am I, of the heavy responsibility which rests upon our two governments in world affairs. I think we should recognize, in honesty to each other, that there are problems on which we may not be able to agree. In particular, the manner in which our disagreements are handled can be of great importance. I hope it will be possible, before too long, for us to meet personally for an informal exchange of views in regards to some of these matters.
The aspirations expressed in these early letters would soon be threatened by a secret invasion plan Kennedy had inherited from his predecessor in office. In March 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had authorized the CIA to organize a coup against the government of Fidel Castro. A 1,400-strong force of Cuban exiles who had been recruited, trained, and funded by the CIA, was to invade Cuba and rally Cuban citizens to rise up and topple Castro. Upon his election, Kennedy was informed of this invasion plan and, after being counseled to do so by confident advisors, gave his consent for the secret invasion to proceed. Thus, the brigade would land at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, where it would be met with unexpected counterattacks from Cuba's military. Kennedy, unwilling to order airstrikes or a full invasion of the island, will have to accept a disastrous defeat.
There will not be, under any conditions, any intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces, and this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities, to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside.
Mr. President, I send you this message in an hour of alarm, fraught with danger for the peace of the whole world. Armed aggression has begun against Cuba. It is a secret to no one that the armed bands invading this country were trained, equipped, and armed in the United States of America. The planes which are bombing Cuban cities belong to the United States of America. The planes and the bombs they are dropping are being supplied by the American government. I approach you, Mr. President, with an urgent call to put an end to aggression against the Republic of Cuba. Military armament and the world political situation are such at this time that any so-called little war can touch off a chain reaction in all parts of the globe.
Mr. Chairman, I have previously stated, and I repeat now, that the United States intends no military intervention in Cuba. I have taken careful note of your statement that the events in Cuba might affect peace in all parts of the world. I trust that this does not mean that the Soviet government, using the situation in Cuba as a pretext, is planning to inflame other areas of the world. I have decided to discuss briefly, at this time, the recent events in Cuba. Any unilateral American intervention in the absence of an external attack upon ourselves or an ally would have been contrary to our traditions and to our international obligations. But let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible. Gentlemen, I know that many of you have further questions about Cuba, but I do not think that any useful national purpose will be served by my going further into the Cuban question this morning. Thank you.
Mr. President, despite all assurances to the contrary, it has now been proved beyond doubt that it was precisely the United States which prepared the intervention, financed its arming, and transported the gangs of mercenaries that invaded the territory of Cuba. United States armed forces also took a direct part in the accomplishment of the gangster attack upon Cuba. By the way, Mr. President, I would like to express my opinion concerning the statements made by you and by certain other United States politicians to the effect that rockets and other weapons could be installed on Cuban territory for possible use against the United States. We have no bases in Cuba, and we do not intend to establish any. And this is well known to you, to your generals and your admirals. If, despite this, they still try to frighten the people by fabrications about Soviet bases on Cuba, that is obviously designed for consumption by simpletons.
Comrades, we have always been in danger of direct aggression. We've been warning about this in the United Nations, that they would find a pretext that they would organize some act of aggression so that they could intervene. Our position is that we will fight to the last man. The United States has no right to meddle in our domestic affairs. We do not speak English, and we do not chew gum. Kennedy's speeches and his threats are similar to Hitler's. Hitler threatened the small neighboring countries, and Kennedy is threatening Cuba and is saying that he will intervene.
Following the events of April 1961, the removal of the communist Castro regime from power in Cuba soon became an obsession for both Kennedy brothers. Bobby Kennedy was in charge of the secret CIA program that resorted to economic and political destabilization, propaganda, sabotage, and assassination plots on key political leaders, including Fidel Castro. In November 1961, Operation Mongoose was designed to do what the Bay of Pigs invasion had failed to do.
The National Security Council agreed that US policy toward Cuba should aim at the downfall of Castro. We should not undertake military intervention in Cuba now, but should do nothing that would foreclose the possibility of military intervention in the future. I believe the Joint Chiefs of Staff have prepared several pretexts which they consider will provide justification for US military intervention in Cuba. General?
Yes, we suggest the following scenarios. We could blow up a ship in Guantanamo and blame Cuba. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami, in other Florida cities, even in Washington. We could use a Soviet-built MiG aircraft flown by US pilots that could provide additional provocation. Or we could create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday.
The president feels that more priority should be given to trying to mount sabotage operations. The CIA put forth the following 4 recommendations today. A, we ought to go all out for increased intelligence. B, there should be considerably more sabotage. C, restrictions on attributability can be relaxed. And D, all efforts should be made to develop new and imaginative approaches to the possibility of getting rid of the Castro regime.
In 1975, a congressional investigation on assassination plots involving foreign leaders summarized its findings on the Castro case as follows. We have found concrete evidence of at least 8 plots involving the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro from 1960 to 1965. Although some of the assassination plots did not advance beyond the stage of planning and preparation, the proposed assassination devices ran the gamut from high-powered rifles to poison pills, poison pens, deadly bacterial powders, and other devices which strain the imagination. The plans to assassinate Castro using poison cigars, exploding seashells, and a contaminated diving suit did not advance beyond the laboratory phase. End of quote. Although not considered as significant a US foreign policy fiasco as the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation Mongoose failed to achieve most of its goals. It did, however, play a significant role in the Soviet decision to defend Cuba.
So the committee has agreed?
Yes, Chairman.
The steps? Come to an agreement with Castro. conclude a military treaty regarding joint defense, station nuclear missiles on Cuba. Our military specialists inform us that they can be reliably camouflaged in a palm forest. The missiles will be under our command. We carried this out secretly, then declare it. This will be an offensive policy.
All Americans, as well as all of our friends in this hemisphere, have been concerned over the recent moves of the Soviet Union to bolster the military power of the Castro regime in Cuba. There is no evidence of the presence of offensive ground-to-ground missiles or of other significant offensive capability, either in Cuban hands or under Soviet direction and guidance. Were it to be otherwise, the gravest issues would arise.
The government of the USSR deems it necessary to draw the attention of the governments of all countries and world opinion to the provocations the United States government is now staging. Provocations which might plunge the world into the disaster of a universal world war with the use of thermonuclear weapons. Bellicose-minded reactionary elements of the United States have long since been conducting an unbridled propaganda campaign against the Cuban Republic, calling for an attack on Cuba, an attack on Soviet ships. In one word, calling for war. The whole world knows that the United States of America has ringed the Soviet Union and other socialist bases with countries with bases. What have they stationed there? Tractors? Are they perhaps growing rice, wheat, potatoes, or some other farm crops there? The armaments and military equipment sent to Cuba are designed exclusively for defensive purposes. Our nuclear weapons are so powerful in their explosive force, and the Soviet Union has so powerful rockets to carry these nuclear warheads that there is no need to search for sites for them beyond the boundaries of the Soviet Union.
Mr. President.
At 8:45 a.m., on the morning of October 16, 1962, McGeorge Bundy informs his president of a major national security crisis. 2 days before, a U-2 spy plane of the US Air Force had taken these photographs. Experts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center identified several launch sites for Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba. Hours later, Kennedy would convene the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, short EXCOM, for the very first time.
Mr. President, this is, of course, a serious development. It's one that all of us had not really believed the Soviets could carry this far. I do think we have to set in motion a chain of events that will eliminate this base.
We could carry out an airstrike within a matter of days. We must agree now that we will set that up prior to the time these missile sites become operational. If it were absolutely essential, it could be done almost literally within a matter of hours. We would be prepared, following an airstrike, for an invasion, both by air and by sea.
One thing Mr. Khrushchev may have in mind is that he knows we have a substantial nuclear superiority, but he also knows we don't really live under fear of his nuclear weapons to the extent that he has to live under fear of ours. Also, we have nuclear weapons nearby, in Turkey and places like that.
How many weapons do we have in Turkey?
About 15, I believe it is.
What is this map?
That shows the circular range capability.
When was this drawn? Is this drawn in relation to the present information?
No, sir. It was drawn in some time ago, I believe. But the ranges there are the nominal ranges of the missiles rather than the maximum. That's a 1,020-mile circle as against a 1,100.
I was just wondering whether San Diego de los Baños is where these missile sites are?
Yes, sir.
I wonder how many of these have been printed out.
Well, the circle is drawn in red ink on the map, Mr. President.
Oh, I see. It was never printed.
No, that's on top.
I see.
Mr. President, could I outline 3 courses of actions we have considered and speak very briefly of each one? The first is what I would call the political course of action. This seemed to me likely to lead to no satisfactory result, and it almost stopped subsequent military action. A second course of action would involve declaration of open surveillance, a statement that we would immediately impose a blockade against offensive weapons entering Cuba in the future. But the third course of action is any of these variants of military action directed against Cuba, starting with an air attack against the missiles. To move beyond that into an invasion following the air attack means the application of between 90 and over 150,000 men to the invasion forces. It seems to me almost certain that any of these forms of direct military action will lead to a Soviet military response of some type, someplace in the world. Now, after we've launched 50 to 100 sorties, what kind of world do we live in? How? How do we stop at that point?
Mr. President, Khrushchev has given us word now that he's coming over in November to the UN. He may be proceeding on the assumption that this isn't going to be discovered at the moment, that here's Cuba, armed against the United States, or possibly try to use it to trade something in Berlin, saying he'll disarm Cuba if we'll yield some of our interests in Berlin and some arrangement for it. I mean, this is a trading ploy.
I would think one thing that I would still cling to is that he's not likely to give Fidel Castro nuclear warheads. I don't believe that has happened or is likely to happen.
Why does he put these in there, though? What is the advantage of that? It's just as if we suddenly began to put a number of medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey. Now that'd be goddamn dangerous, I would think.
Well, we did, Mr. President.
Yeah, but that was 5 years ago.
How does the introduction of these weapons to Cuba change the military equation, the military position of the US versus the USSR?
Ted Sorensen has provided a summary on that issue. It is generally agreed that these missiles, even when fully operational, do not significantly alter the balance of power. Nevertheless, it is generally agreed that the United States cannot tolerate the known presence of offensive nuclear weapons in a country 90 miles from our shore, if our courage and our commitments are ever to be believed by either allies or adversaries.
So, speaking strictly in military terms, it doesn't change it at all. It is not a military problem that we're facing. It's a political problem. It's a problem of holding the alliance together, of dealing with our domestic public. If there is a strike without preliminary discussion with Khrushchev, we must assume we kill several hundred Soviet citizens.
Mr. President, if we act without warning, without giving Khrushchev some way out, that's like Pearl Harbor. It's the kind of conduct that one might expect of the Soviet Union. It is not conduct that one expects of the United States.
And then if he says, if you're going to do that, we're going to grab Berlin, the thing is, he's going to grab Berlin anyway.
I met with Ambassador Dobrynin last evening on the 3rd floor of the Russian embassy. As far as he knew, there were still no missiles in Cuba. From his conversations with Gromyko, he doesn't believe Gromyko thought that there were any missiles in Cuba. He said he was going to contact his government and find out about this matter.
I was not informed to the very last moment about the missiles in Cuba.
Do you mean that I did not tell you, the ambassador, about the missiles in Cuba?
No, you did not tell me.
That means it must have been a very big secret.
During the course of the day, opinions had obviously switched from the advantages of a first strike on the missile sites and on Cuban aviation to a blockade. Bundy continued to argue against any action on the grounds that there would be inevitably a Soviet reprisal against Berlin, and that this would divide our alliance, and that we would bear that responsibility. Everyone else felt that for us to fail to respond would throw into question our willingness to respond over Berlin, would divide our allies and our country, that we would be faced with a crunch over Berlin in 2 or 3 months. The consensus was that we should go ahead with the blockade.
Now, as for the Berlin situation, I do not share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they're going to knock off Berlin. We've got the Berlin problem staring us in the face anyway. If we don't do anything to Cuba, then they're going to push on Berlin. And push real hard, because they've got us on the run.
What do you think the reprisal would be?
I don't think they're going to make any reprisal if we tell them that the Berlin situation is just like it's always been. This blockade and political action I see leading into war. This is almost as bad as appeasement in Munich. I just don't see any other solution except direct military action right now. A blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response. And I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President.
What did you say?
You're in a pretty bad fix.
You're in there with me, General. Bob, where are we on the blockade?
Mr. President, as I see it, a blockade would bring with it the following disadvantages. 1, it would take a long time to achieve the objective of eliminating strategic weapons from Cuba. 2, it would result in serious political trouble in the United States. 3, the world position of the United States might appear to be weakening. The advantages are: 1, it would cause us the least trouble with our allies. 2, it avoids any surprise air attack on Cuba, which is contrary to our tradition. 3, it is the only military course of action compatible with our position as leader of the free world. 4, it avoids a sudden military move, which might provoke a response from the USSR, which could escalate in general war.
An airstrike, then?
An airstrike would not destroy all the missiles it launches in Cuba. And at best, we would knock off 2/3 of these missiles. In my view, the probability is high that an airstrike would lead inevitably to an invasion. I doubt that the Soviets would take an airstrike on Cuba without resorting to a very major response. We could lose control of the situation, which might escalate to general war.
I agree. an airstrike would force them to come back with a major response. They might blockade Berlin. Thank you, Bob. Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance on the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites are now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character, and that the Soviet Union had no need or desire to station strategic missiles on the territory of any other nation. This secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in violation of Soviet assurances and in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of a worldwide nuclear war in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The cost of freedom is always high, and Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Thank you, and good night.
Comrades, all these events are the culmination of a policy pursued by the United States. The imperialists, the warmongers, and the most reactionary circles of the United States. The imperialists have now invented the terms offensive and defensive arms. Which are the offensive weapons and which are the defensive? The thing that determines the offensive or defensive character of a weapon is not their shape, but their use, their employment. There is nothing more ridiculous than to say that we have aggressive intentions against the United States. If the United States wishes disarmament, that is magnificent. Let us all disarm magnificent. However, we are not in an agreement with a policy which calls for disarming us in the face of the aggressor. That is so stupid, so ridiculous and so absurd that it is not worth wasting time merely thinking about such idiocy.
Dear Mr. Chairman, I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country could win and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor. Sincerely, John F. Kennedy.
Mr. President, I have just received your letter and have also acquainted myself with text of your speech of October 22nd regarding Cuba. I should say frankly that measures outlined in your statement represent a serious threat to peace and security of all peoples. The Charter of the United Nations and international norms do not give right to any state whatsoever to establish in international waters control of vessels bound for shores of the Cuban Republic. It is self-understood that we also cannot recognize the right of the United States to establish control over armaments essential to the Republic of Cuba for the strengthening of its defensive capacity. We confirm that armaments now on Cuba, regardless of the classification to which they belong, are destined exclusively for defensive purposes in order to secure the Cuban Republic from an attack of any aggressor.
I, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, to defend the security of the United States, do hereby proclaim that the forces under my command are ordered, beginning at 2 p.m. Greenwich time, October 24th, 1962, to interdict the delivery of offensive weapons and associated material to Cuba. I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed.
You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us. The actions of the United States with regard to Cuba constitute outright banditry, or, if you will, the folly of degenerate imperialism. Unfortunately, such folly can bring grave suffering to the people of all countries, and to no lesser degree to the American people themselves. Therefore, Mr. President, if you coolly weigh the situation which has developed, not giving way to passions, you will understand that the Soviet Union cannot fail to reject the arbitrary demands of the United States. I do not doubt that if someone attempted to dictate similar conditions to you, you would reject such an attempt. And we also say no.
Mr. President, we are receiving reports that certain Soviet ships appear to have stopped or turned back. One is the Poltava, which we are most interested in. Certain others are showing indications that they might be turning back also.
Make sure that there are no interceptions of any target for at least another hour. No further action until we can clarify this information.
The thing is, I do not think that the USA right now could embark on blitzkrieg operations. We do not want to unleash a war. We wanted to intimidate and restrain the USA vis-à-vis Cuba. The tragic thing, they can attack and we will respond. This could escalate into a large-scale war. If there is an airborne assault, use the tactical atomic weaponry, but the strategic one not until orders are given.
We are here today and have been this week for one single reason. Because the Soviet Union secretly introduced this menacing, offensive military buildup into the island of Cuba while assuring the world that nothing was further from their thoughts. Mr. Zorin, that I don't have your talent for obfuscation, for distortion, for confusing language, and for double talk, let me say something to you, Mr. Ambassador. We do have the evidence. We have it, and it's clear and incontrovertible. And let me say something else. Those weapons must be taken out of Cuba. You, the Soviet Union, has created this new danger, not the United States. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no?
I am not in American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in a fashion in which a prosecutor does.
You are in the court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist.
You will have your answer in due course. Don't worry.
I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over if that's your decision.
Dear Comrade Khrushchev, given the analysis of the situation and the reports which have reached us, I consider an attack to be almost imminent within the next 24 to 72 hours. After such an invasion, the Soviet Union must never allow circumstances in which the imperialists could carry out a nuclear first strike against it. If the imperialists managed to carry out an invasion of Cuba, a brutal act in violation of universal and moral law, then that would be the moment to eliminate this danger forever in an act of most legitimate self-defense. However harsh and terrible the solution, there would be no other. Fraternally, Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro proposed that we ourselves should be the first to start an atomic war. Do you know what that would mean? Castro clearly has no idea about what thermonuclear war is. After all, if a war started, it would primarily be Cuba that would vanish from the face of Earth. What would we gain if we ourselves started a war? Millions of people would die, our people too. Only a person who has no idea about what nuclear war means or who has been so blinded by revolutionary passion can talk like that. Send word to Cuba straight away. We categorically confirm that you are prohibited from using nuclear weapons from missiles and aircraft without orders from Moscow. Dear Mr. President, we are of sound mind and understand perfectly well that if we attack you, you will respond the same way. But you too will receive the same that you hurl against us. And I think that you also understand this. Only lunatics or suicides who themselves want to perish and to destroy the whole world before they die could do this. We do not at all want to destroy your country. We want to compete with your country on a peaceful basis. If assurances were given by the President and the government of the United States that the USA itself would not participate in an attack on Cuba and would restrain others from actions of this sort, if you would recall your fleet, this would immediately change everything. Then too, the question of armaments would disappear. Dear Mr. President, How are we, the Soviet Union, to assess your actions, which are expressed in the fact that you have surrounded the Soviet Union with military bases, surrounded our allies with military bases, placed military bases literally around our country and stationed your missile armaments there? This is no secret. You are disturbed over Cuba. You say that this disturbs you because it is 90 miles by sea from the coast of the United States of America. But Turkey adjoins us. Do you consider then that you have the right to demand security for your own country and the removal of the weapons you call offensive, but do not accord the same right to us? You have placed destructive missile weapons, which you call offensive, in Turkey, literally next to us. We are willing to remove from Cuba the means which you regard as offensive. Your representatives will make a declaration to the effect that the United States will remove its analogous means from Turkey. We will make a statement not to interfere in Turkey's internal affairs, not to invade Turkey, not to make available our territory as a bridgehead for such an invasion. The United States government will make a similar statement within the framework of the Security Council regarding Cuba.
We had one deal in public, now we've got a different deal in private. How can we negotiate with somebody who changes his deal before we even get a chance to reply, and announces publicly the deal before we receive it?
I think there must have been an overruling in Moscow.
The statement was a very tough position and varied considerably from the tone of the personal letter he sent. His position will get wide support. Over a year ago, we wanted to get the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey because they had become obsolete and of little military value. From the political point of view, it would be hard to get support on an airstrike against Cuba because many would think that we would make a good trade if they take the missiles out of Turkey in the event the Russians would agree to remove the missiles from Cuba.
About that, have a look at this.
Lipman?
Yeah.
The only place that is truly comparable with Cuba is Turkey. The only place where there are strategic weapons right on the frontier of the Soviet Union. The Soviet missile base in Cuba, like the US NATO base in Turkey, is of little military value. The Soviet military base in Cuba is defenseless, and the base in Turkey is all but obsolete. The two bases could be dismantled without altering the world balance of power. An agreement of this sort may be doable, and there may exist a way out of the tyranny of automatic and uncontrollable events.
I suggest we tell Khrushchev privately that the position in his second letter was impossible for us, but that the position he took in his first statement was different, and we are studying these proposals. In the meantime, however, time is running out.
So we ignore the second letter and only respond to the first statement. Dear Mr. Chairman, I have read your letter of October 26th with great care and find in it the indication of a willingness on your part to seek a calm solution to the problem. I welcome that and assure you that my desire is the same. The first thing that needs to be done, however, is for work to cease on offensive missile bases in Cuba and all weapon systems in Cuba capable of offensive use rendered inoperable under effective United Nations arrangements.
The sentence isn't quite complete. To be rendered inoperable.
I just changed line 2. That finds an indication of his willingness, just statement of your willingness, or welcome your statement of your desire, because we don't really find willingness.
I have read your letter of October 26th with great care and find in it a statement.
And welcome your statement?
I think we can cut the next sentence.
And welcome your statement of your desire.
Then perhaps we just say, my desire is the same.
Why not just say my desire is the same as his?
Why do we bother you with it? Why don't you guys work it out?
There's no question of bothering me.
Why don't we try to work it out without you being able to pick it apart?
Dear Mr. Chairman, the key elements of your proposals which seem generally acceptable, are as follows. 1. You would agree to remove these weapon systems from Cuba under appropriate United Nations observation and supervision, and undertake, with suitable safeguards, to halt the further introduction of such weapon systems into Cuba. 2. We, on our part, would agree, A, to remove promptly the quarantine measures now in effect, and B, to give assurances against an invasion of Cuba.
Mr. President, one of our U-2 planes has overflown the Soviet Union by accident due to navigational error. The Russians are sure to make a fuss about this.
Mr. President, what is this? A provocation? One of your planes violates our frontier during this anxious time we are both experiencing, when everything has been put into combat readiness. Is it not a fact that an intruding American plane could be easily taken for a nuclear bomber, which might push us to a fateful step?
Dear Mr. Chairman, the pilot made a serious navigational error which carried him over Soviet territory. I regret this incident and will see to it that every precaution is taken to prevent recurrence.
A U-2 was shot down.
A U-2 was shot down?
Yes, it got shot down over Cuba.
Was the pilot killed?
The pilot's body is in the plane.
Well, now, this is much of an escalation by them, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. General Taylor feels like we should make an airstrike tomorrow on the site responsible for shooting down the U-2 plane. We must now be ready to attack Cuba by launching 500 sorties on the first day. Invasion has become inevitable.
Sent this to Cuba. We believe that you were too hasty in shooting down the U-2 plane at the time an agreement was emerging to avert by peaceful means an attack on Cuba. We have made the decision to dismantle the missiles and remove them. Begin to implement this measure.
I told Ambassador Dobrynin that in the last 2 hours we had found that our planes flying over Cuba had been fired upon and that one of our U-2s had been shot down and the pilot killed. This was an extremely serious turn in events, and there is very little time left. We have to have a commitment by at least tomorrow that those bases would be removed. He should understand that if they did not remove those bases, then we would remove them. He then asked me about Khrushchev's other proposal, dealing with the removal of the missiles from Turkey. I replied that there could no be quid pro quo. It was up to NATO to make the decision. If some time elapsed, I mentioned 4 or 5 months, I said I was sure that these matters could be resolved satisfactorily, and that he had better contact Mr. Khrushchev and have a commitment from him by the next day to withdraw these missile bases under United Nations supervision. For otherwise, I said, there would be drastic consequences.
We agree to dismantle the missile installations.
The tension of the situation was growing, and the psychological tension was growing also. The whole of Cuba was ready for defense. And suddenly, concessions on the part of the Soviet Union produced a sense of oppressiveness, a feeling of deep disappointment, bitterness, and pain has appeared, as if we were deprived not only of our missiles, but of the very symbol of solidarity.
How should one assess the result of these 6 days, which shook the world? Who won? I am of the opinion that we won. What aim did the Americans have? To attack Cuba and get rid of the Cuban Republic. Our main aim was to save Cuba, to save the Cuban Revolution. We achieved our objective. That would not have happened without our missiles in Cuba. The USA would have attacked Cuba. One might ask whether we made concessions. Of course we did. It was one concession for another. But this mutual concession has brought us victory. This clash, and we were truly on the verge of war, demonstrated that war today is not inevitably destined by fate, that it can be avoided.
Dear Mr. Chairman, I think that you and I, with our heavy responsibilities for the maintenance of peace, were aware that developments were approaching a point where events could have become unmanageable. Perhaps now, as we step back from danger, we should give priority to questions relating to the proliferation of nuclear weapons on Earth and in outer space, and to the great effort for a nuclear test ban.
Dear Mr. President, my colleagues and I consider that both sides have displayed restraint and wisdom in liquidating the military conflict, which might have resulted in a world thermonuclear war. And we were very close to such war indeed. Apparently, there will be such scribblers who will engage in hair-splitting over our agreement, digging as to who made greater concessions to whom. I would say that we both made a concession to reason and found a reasonable solution which enabled us to ensure peace for all. Mr. President, we have now conditions ripe for finalizing the agreement on signing a treaty on cessation of tests of thermonuclear weapons, banning of tests in atmosphere, in outer space and underwater. But the best thing to do would be to disband all military blocs. We are not coming up with this now, though we spoke of this before.
Cuba. Cuba. Cuba es un país amante de la paz. Cuba is a peace-loving country. Pero during recent events, los Estados Unidos managed to present themselves as a peace-loving country in the eyes of the world. They exposed Soviet aggression. They demonstrated courage, and they even liquidated bases of the Soviets in Cuba. Los Estados Unidos, los Yankee imperialistas, even managed to portray the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba como intenciones agresivas de la Unión Soviética. Los Yankees, by achieving the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, they, in a way, received the right to forbid other countries from making bases available. Creemos, we believe that the decisions made by the Soviet Union were a mistake. You offended our feelings by not consulting us. You recognized the right of los imperialistas to violate derechos internacionales, el derecho internacional. This is great damage done to your policy. This fact really worries us. It may cause dificultades para mantener la unidad de los países socialistas. It seems to us that there already are cracks in the unity of the socialist camp.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot agree with your statement that you have fulfilled your commitments. We suppose that part of that trouble here may be in Cuba. It is difficult for me to understand why the Cubans are so resistant, unless they are determined to see the crisis prolonged or worsened. We both have means of influencing the Cuban government, and I do not believe that we can allow that government to frustrate the clear understandings our two governments have reached in the interests of peace.
The Presidium of the Central Committee in full quorum believed that the position of our Cuban friends on this issue cannot be considered rational. Cuba, which now does not even want to consult with us, wants to practically drag us behind itself by a leash and wants to pull us into a war with America by its actions. We cannot and will not agree to this. The Cubans, by their stubbornness, and I would say by their certain arrogance, which shows in their statements about sovereignty, help the most reactionary forces in the United States.
In my opinion, the Soviets have lied shamefully. They planned a criminal attack on the United States as never before. You have succeeded in turning aside the greatest danger the United States has ever experienced. A great success for yourself and the American people, Mr. President.
Well, as one could verify, the missiles have left Cuba.
Have all Soviet technicians left Cuba?
We don't know exactly about the rocket experts. They could still be there. We unfortunately can't tell from the air if someone is a missile expert or not.
And do you know anything about Khrushchev's present state of health? I heard that recently Khrushchev has been drinking diligently and that Khrushchev is a drunk.
People say bad things about all heads of government, Chancellor.
At the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. We came that close to nuclear war at the end. Rational individuals. Kennedy was rational. Khrushchev was rational. Castro was rational. Rational individuals came that close to total destruction of their societies. And that danger exists today.
Dear Mr. President, we and you were prepared to fight, and this would lead to thermonuclear war with all its dreadful consequences. We took it into account and, being convinced that mankind would never forgive the statesmen who would not exhaust all possibilities to prevent catastrophe, agreed to a compromise. I consider it useful for us to continue to maintain the possibility of confidential exchange of opinion, because a minimum of personal trust is necessary for leading statesmen of both countries, and this corresponds to the interests of our countries and peoples, to the interest of peace all over the world. On the eve of the new year, we extend to the American people and also to you and your family New Year's congratulations and very best wishes from the Soviet people and from us personally.
Dear Mr. Chairman, I entirely share your view that some trust is necessary for leading statesmen of our two countries. I believe that it is important to build trust wherever possible. There appear to be no differences between your views and mine regarding the need for eliminating war in this nuclear age. Perhaps only those who have the responsibility for controlling these weapons fully realize the awful devastation their use would bring. On behalf of the American people and myself, I extend best wishes for the new year to the Soviet people and to you and your families.
You should meet with Robert Kennedy and give voice to the following considerations. We sincerely wish that your brother enters history as the President of the United States of America who was able to place above all else the need for statesmanlike wisdom and as the government official who, together with Nikita Khrushchev, wrote his name in the Great Book of Peace.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. I speak to you tonight in a spirit of hope. 18 years ago, the advent of nuclear weapons changed the course of the world as well as the war. The United States and the Soviet Union have frequently communicated suspicions and warnings to each other, but very rarely hope. Our representatives have met at the summit and at the brink. They have met in Washington and in Moscow, in Geneva, and at the United Nations. But too often, these meetings have produced only darkness, discord, and disillusion. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. This achievement of this goal is not a victory for one side. It is a victory for mankind. It is an important first step, a step towards peace, a step towards reason, a step away from war. According to the ancient Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step. My fellow Americans, let us take that first step. Let us, if we can, step back from the shadows of war and seek out the way of peace. And if that journey is 1,000 miles or even more, let history record that we, in this land, at this time, took the first step. Some say that it is useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitude toward the Soviet Union and toward the Cold War.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.
Thank you, and good night.
The use of nuclear weapons in a war would mean the end of humanity. Each and every government in the whole world has the obligation to respect the right to life of each and every nation and of the totality of all people on the planet. Albert Einstein himself stated unmistakably, "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." We fully comprehend what he wanted to convey, and he was absolutely right. Yet in the wake of a global nuclear war, there wouldn't be anybody around to make use of those sticks and stones. Let us have the courage to proclaim that all nuclear or conventional weapons, everything that is to make war, must disappear.
Wir danken auch der Technik vom Amerikahaus.
Okay, wie lang?